It's wonderful working on a newspaper. You meet such interesting people.
You put on a record, you take it off.
To the extent that we say that film noir deals with post-war films set in the city in which people encounter a world of criminality, often are seduced into that world, obviously certain elements of The Naked City fit that mold. The story of the crime in the film is very much a noir crime-type story, but it's obviously framed by a larger narrative, and that's the narrative of crime fighting. In a sense, this film begins where film noir ends. So that, for example, the film opens with the eruptive crime, the moment where crime bursts on the scene. So there is a noir story, but it's almost as if the noir story has already transpired and it's given way to this other story, which is the patient, plodding, often repetitive work of the law enforcement figures. And that's very typical of the police procedural.
Morning, Lieutenant.
Hey, Schaefer. Well, what's the story?
Dead woman's name was Jean Dexter, 26 years old, unmarried.
If a genre like film noir is often unsettling, it seems to me the police procedural, in contrast, is often very reassuring. There is an order to the universe, crime can always be stamped out, the dangers of the world can be held at bay. And to that extent, it seems to me interesting to ask why certain films have to reassure in the period of the post-war. What does America need to be reassured about? And I think in The Naked City suggests at least two things. On the one hand, the very idea that men have to go about this kind of repetitive, plodding, patient investigation is itself part of an act of reassurance. It's telling the post-war male, yes, your job may be repetitive, yes, you may have to do the same damn thing one day after the other, but there's a purpose to that. And it's interesting, I think post-war America is very much raising the question, what is the worth of a man? What does it mean to be an ordinary American? This film is within a year of Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, where the idea is to be one cog in the system means you're replaceable, means you can be downsized. Your life doesn't have much worth. There's very much in the mythology of America this kind of pioneer, frontier, go-getter mythology. The American male strives forward. And in that respect, World War II for many American men is sort of the last great adventure. And the question is, what happens when you come home from war?
When it comes to legwork, Detective Jimmy Halloran is an expert. In the war, he walked halfway across Europe with a rifle in his hand.
And so, for example, by the 50s, sociologists like David Reisman are talking about the lonely crowd. Men are now outer-directed. They've lost their inner direction. They're no longer self-motivated. They're simply yes men who take orders. There's a lot of anxiety about, does one matter? Has one been absorbed into the system? Has one lost one's pioneer, go-getter spirit? And I think in that respect, the police procedural is trying to say, yes, it does matter to be an organization man. And it's doing this in several ways. First of all, unlike film noir, it's saying there is something valuable and even potentially attractive about blandness, about ordinariness. And I think you see this with the figure of the cop Jimmy, who comes home to his little suburban sitcom family. His wife's running around with skimpy outfits, and he is the man of the home, even though there's this whole little subplot about how he can't really discipline his son. He's sort of the Dr. Spock father who doesn't want to use the stick at home because he's going to apply force elsewhere. But the film, like a number of other films, is asking, what does it mean to be normal? And is there a value to being just an ordinary Joe? Only 2 years later, in A Lonely Place, Nicholas Ray will make a film where we have an aberrant criminal figure played by Humphrey Bogart and a good, bland policeman. And the wife of the policeman, when people are extolling the virtues of the Humphrey Bogart character and how interesting he is because he's different, she'll say to her husband, but I like you because you're bland and boring. That's what I want. I want normalcy. And I think the film is standing up for this notion of a kind of cheerful, sitcom, sunny, ordinary world. So the first way in which the film reassures about masculinity is to say, blandness is great. Blandness is the value of post-war America. To be different is to be aberrant.
Well, what's with you?
Niall sold this about an hour ago to a jeweler on Madison Avenue. Got $600 for it.
Wait, Dave, where's that list of stuff that was stolen from Dexter?
At the same time, and I think this is another way the film's reassuring, there's a fascination with little eccentricities that make each character different from another. So even though they're really all the same, anybody can be slotted in if you need someone to follow Niles, or if you need someone to follow another suspect, anybody can do it, and all through the film, people are being substituted. Yet, there's also this kind of vague hint or vague effort at saying, yes, but there really still are individuals, because Dan has his Irish songs, and we see his life at home. Jimmy has his family. One of the cops has a very thick Brooklyn accent. They all physically look different, as if to say, yes, they're cogs, but they're not really. And yet, obviously, it's only at the level of these little tics or eccentricities that any one person is distinguished from another.
An interesting man, that Niles. He operates very strange.
Say, how about I check this cigarette case with the department list of all jewelry stolen in the last year or so?
All right, I don't think you'll get anything, though. He'd be crazy to unload a stolen item in the middle of a hot case like this.
I think another way this vague nod towards individuality shows up is that several policemen are allowed moments of individual initiative. They're allowed to be somewhat inventive. And the idea is you should never be totally inventive. You should never throw the rules overboard. You can't really go your own way. But within the company, within the firm, within an organization, there's room for kind of controlled experimentation. So Jimmy will decide, at one point he'll beg Dan to let him follow a lead. The burly cop with the accent says, let me go through all the list of all the jewels that have been stolen. And on the one hand, they know what the rules are. You shouldn't let Jimmy go off on his own. Time is tight. Maybe we shouldn't allow this one cop to pore over the jewelry list. But there's also a way in which it's saying companies, firms, organizations survive by allowing little play, a little experimentation at the margins, as long as it doesn't go too far, as long as it's to the benefit of the larger system.
Well, that's the way you run a case, lad. Step by step.
Oh, I suppose so. Look, Dan, do me a favor. Let me waste some time on this McAllis angle.
Okay, lad.
Swell.
Phone in once a day.
Right.
And then finally, I think another way in which the film is saying that there's something reassuring about the world of plodding, repetitive, ordinary work is that it's necessary in the world we're living in. This is a world of danger, of criminality. It's almost the cliche of it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Here it's more, it's a boring, bland, repetitive job, but somebody's got to do it because there's always going to be crime out there. And I think that goes along with the idea of the famous, there are 8 million stories in the naked city. This is one of them. On the one hand, as I was saying before, any individual crime can be bookended. The police exist, a crime happens, the police stop the crime no longer exists, and the government agency continues on, and there's a way in which it's going to continue on forever. And I think that's why so many police procedurals show these big police buildings. It has a kind of stability, a kind of permanence, whereas crime is transitory, crime is fleeting. On the other hand, every time you root out one crime, make it disappear, the idea is another crime's going to come along. There's a kind of permanence to criminality also. So the police are always going to be necessary. There's always going to be one more crime to solve. The film very much is about a kind of seriality. That is, the city is a place where crime, once a crime is solved, another crime will be waiting. And there's often in the police procedural, the end sequence where they come back to the office, they may come back to find a memo about a next crime to investigate. You finish one to start the other. And again, I think that also goes along with this idea of work as being you complete one task only to confront the next task. The life of the post-war laborer is going to be endless repetition. And the life of the city is going to be endless repetition. Each crime may be different, but each crime will appear at its proper moment. And every crime, once solved, will be replaced by another. But it's also a seriality of the form itself. Hollywood is a factory producing one film after another. By the late 40s on into the 50s, Hollywood is not only a film industry, but a television industry. And it seems to me absolutely appropriate that The Naked City becomes eventually, by the end of the 50s, a TV show, because TV at some level is the ultimate serial form, where you finish an episode, then to start the next episode. And The Naked City will then be about generating new stories. So at some level, and again, that's a tension. On the one hand, you want to imagine a world where there'd be no crime, where everything would be made right again. But in the world of fiction, if you did that, there'd be no more stories to tell. You need disturbance to keep the story going. And TV is almost that kind of Arabian 1001 Nights, where every night when you finish the story, you have to start telling a new story to keep the machine going. If you stop, you're dead. So you need to endlessly generate new product. And it's interesting, the film very clearly wants to be about ordinariness, the everyday, even a film about the everyday people, and it's very clearly inspired by Italian neorealism and the idea of taking the camera into the street. It's sort of proletarian in its image of the ordinary cop going about his work. And yet, on the other hand, there's also this sense of the people are the teeming, dangerous immigrant masses on the Lower East Side, the crowd into which the escaping criminal can be absorbed. There's even the sense of he's a man of the people. When a little girl says, oh yeah, I like the guy who plays the harmonica. And so there's a sense in which that's the world where the criminal is at home, among his people, the ethnic inhabitants of this world that will shelter criminality, out of which criminality festers. And that's a very different world than the rest of the city. So it's a world, for example, if the policeman ventures into other worlds with confidence, here Jimmy will go into that world. He goes to Garza's house alone, or apartment, and is disarmed. There's the sense of this is the one place where the policeman's masculinity is no longer assured, where the tables can be turned on him.
When did Harold call in? Was he alone? Now get this. Send out an emergency. Rush every available squad car. Block off the streets around it.
It's virtually the only moment where we see a cop put on the line. I mean, Garza will shoot at them during the chase, but all of that happens towards the end of the film. At every other moment, the police do their work. They know how to do it. They are the controlling figures. When you get to the Lower East Side, suddenly it's Garza's territory. He knows the back alleys. He knows the strange little tangle of streets and blocks. So there's a sense of being out of your element for the policeman when you go into that world. And it's interesting because you haven't seen the Lower East Side before the end of the film. It's as if we've mapped every part of the city, and suddenly there's this new other place, and it's presented as the exotic other. It's almost as if it itself has suddenly erupted onto the scene. A lot of post-war films have a very ambivalent notion of the ordinary, of the people. On the one hand, there's this idea that the people work together. So there's the mythology of a small town or a neighborhood is everybody will stand up for everybody else. Garza is not known by these people as being a criminal. He's known as being like them, and therefore they will stand up for him. So the woman selling root beer who sort of worries that she's betrayed Garza. There's a little kid who likes Garza, and there's this idea he's among his people, and the people will stand up for each other. The flip side of that is obviously that they're standing up for a criminal, and there's always the danger that these poor little ethnic communities will get it wrong. They'll defend the wrong person. Their populism will be misguided. And it's interesting that this Lower East Side, as presented in the film, it's kind of a multicultural melting pot. We see Chinese being interviewed, we see Italians, we see what seem to be Jewish figures. So it's a little bit of everything, and there's something progressive about that. On the other hand, there still is also this notion that they're just the ordinary people. They don't have all the reason, the rationality, the intelligence, the smartness, the faith in America that the police show. And so the film still, in certain ways, is very hierarchical. It's maybe complicated a little bit by the fact that the lead policeman is Irish, although there'd be an interesting study to do about, and people have done this, about when different ethnic communities get accepted into America. And there's books with titles like When the Irish Became White People. That is, that at certain moments, certain ethnic communities are seen as outsiders, not part of white middle-class normalcy, and bit by bit are accepted or given their place in the dominant culture. Irishness, yes, it's immigrant, but it's cute, eccentric, it's whimsical, and again, I think Barry Fitzgerald is an important figure in this. He's played in things like Going My Way. He's sort of the lovable Irish figure, which itself is a kind of trope or cliche in American culture, the leprechaunish, somewhat clownish figure, even as he's also the methodical, rational being. I think another aspect of this idea of going into the Lower East Side, of the police going in, is something else that I think is interesting in the police procedurals, which is there's a kind of voyeurism, as if let's go and see these other worlds so we can glimpse in at them. And I'm struck by how many 40s films often have scenes where illicit things happen through windows, as if you're peeking in. And sometimes it's the illicit moment of crime. So for example, this film, we see the men strangle Jean, and we see it through a window, and then the camera actually moves into a room. And there's a number of other films that have murders seen through windows, Rear Window, or The Rope, which is from the same year as The Naked City. There's even a film called The Window, where a little boy peeks into a window and sees a murder go on. It can also be peeking into a window and seeing other kinds of illicit things, sexual activity, a world of enviable, high-class, fine living. The way in which the police procedural is like film noir, even though I think it's unlike it in other respects, is that it's often about kind of lust, jealousy, desire for the things you don't have. So you peek in on a world of the privileged. You peek in on the world of the rich and famous. Here in this film, you peek in and say, we don't want to be like that because that's a world of backstabbing. It's an empty world. It's a world of silliness, the socialite woman who's obviously held up for ridicule. On the other hand, like noir, there are figures in the story who do envy the world of riches and want the fast criminal path to success. And in that respect, it seems to me Niles, the Howard Duff character, is the closest to the noir figure. He's the guy he's sort of like Walter Neff in Double Indemnity. He wants it all. He wants it quickly. He doesn't want to go the normal path. He doesn't want to play by the rules. And he turns to criminality. And like the noir character, he's seduced into this by a woman, and he pays the price. But there is a way in which the police procedural, on the one hand, is on a quest for normalcy, but on the other hand, you can see this kind of fascination with the other world, the strange other things, a world of privilege, the nightclub world, the world of fashion, and these ordinary proletarian policemen keep being put in worlds that are more elegant, more classy, more spectacular than the worlds they live in ordinarily. So in this film, they go into the world of fashion. They go into the world of high society. They go in ultimately to condemn it and pull back, but there's still this kind of flirtation with all the other lifestyles out there. It's very clear that even though this is the same team that did Brute Force, or many of the same figures, it's a very different film. Just as it seems to me the police procedural is the flip side of noir, the police procedural in a certain way is also the flip side of the prison movie that's about people who are made worse by the penal system. And Brute Force is very much within that genre of if you're sent to jail, terrible things will happen. And there's, I think, in the prison genre, very clearly a critique of the American way of life. Because if it sets up prisons, if they're run rationally, the conclusion is they make criminals, or they make criminals even worse than they were. And there's a way in which, very clearly, as a number of scholars have pointed out, Brute Force is presenting the prison almost as a fascist state, with a warden who's listening to Wagner at one point, and the downtrodden proletarian figures being tortured by him, mistreated by him. Whereas in The Naked City, there's an incredible faith in law and authority, an incredible faith in those figures who stand up for legality, who are going to actually be sending the criminals to the very prison that Brute Force showed was a bad place. It seems to me it's very much like the first part of Law and Order, the ferreting out of the crime. And if you remember, just as Naked City has a voiceover narration, Law and Order has a voiceover narration, and again, this very authoritative male voice who tells us that there are two branches to the criminal justice system, those who investigate the crimes and those who put the crimes on trial. And the police procedural is saying, let's look at the phase of investigation. And Brute Force, we almost might say, is the ironic depiction of what happens after. And that can't be shown in a film like The Naked City. You can't show what's going to happen later. All you can show is Niles in the cell, but you can't talk about prison life. So it has to end with the imprisonment, the act of imprisoning. Or the TV show Dragnet would always end with so-and-so was sentenced, and then you see this stamp, a hand stamps the date of the show as if to say, this is all that matters, that the criminals are brought to justice. We don't need to talk about what's going to happen after. I think it's noteworthy that many of the team that works on a film like Brute Force, but also works on a film like Naked City, many of the personnel are figures on the left and are figures who will be targeted by the Red Scare. It surprises me that this is a script by two blacklisted writers accused by the House Un-American Activities Committee of being un-American, because in certain ways in which the film is very much affirmative of the American institution of law and order. On the other hand, as I say, the film is afraid to follow that through to its conclusion of talking about the penal system, because a film like Brute Force has unveiled that the penal system is dangerous. So Naked City has to stop before that. I've also mentioned that the film has this kind of complicated tension, as many post-war films do, around the people. On the one hand, the Naked City has a certain proletarian side to it. Let's go down into the streets. Let's wander among the ordinary citizens. Let's not deal with the aristocratic Sherlock Holmes type cop, but just ordinary guys doing their labor. On the other hand, it still very clearly distinguishes between cops and other kinds of people, the ethnic inhabitants of the Lower East Side, the aberrant criminal figure. It's interesting that in the voiceover, one of the things the voiceover does is at times go from Mark Hellinger into other people's heads. And it's often to make fun of ordinary people, the doorman and his friend who are interested in the crime that went on inside the house. And again, there's that kind of voyeurism. The two gum-chewing girls who seem to be from Brooklyn or the Bronx and have thick accents and are sort of mocked as sort of low-culture figures, and again, voyeurs. People who are caught up in the sensationalism of the crime, who are presented as not being very savvy, and again are distinguished from the cops. The cops are intelligent. The cops, they have their own eccentricities, Dan with his Irishness, but they are at least figures of reason, enlightenment, savviness, whereas a lot of the other ordinary people are shown as kind of dolts, crass, kitschy, cheesy in a certain way. And I think the film is in a kind of complicated tension around its own left politics and its own populism.
It's 1 o'clock in the morning again, and this is the city, and these are the lights.
I think the voiceover in Naked City does a number of different things, some connected, some potentially in tension with each other. So on the one hand, it does what the voiceover does in so many police procedurals. That is, it identifies with a kind of godly omniscience that is associated with a particular agency investigating a crime. And it's as if there is a logical, forceful, strong, masculine government agency, just as there is a strong, logical voice that's going to narrate and identify with this government agency as it goes about its business. And so many government agency films have that kind of authoritative, godlike, generally or exclusively male voice. I mean, it's very, the famous opening of something like Dragnet, this is the city, Los Angeles, that kind of thing. So that's one function, is to fit in with this reassurance about the proper workings of the government agency. And then the narration will tell us, will introduce us to the workings of the agency. So often in the police procedural film or the government agency film, the narrator will say, and this is a laboratory, and this is the radio room, and this is the such and such. So it's part of this kind of pedagogy, introducing us to and making us good citizens who appreciate the proper workings of government. Yet I think the narration in The Naked City also has several other functions, in part because it doesn't do exactly the same things as the narration in other police procedurals. First of all, it goes in and out of the godlike voice and actually enters people's heads. It's a kind of wandering narration. Very few police procedurals will do that. But here, we will leave Hellinger and get other voiceovers, people's inner thoughts, a bored man working at a newspaper at night, the two gum-chewing girls. And it's almost as if it's saying, yes, there's authority, yes, there's this godlike vision above the film, but we also have to go down into the streets, wander among the people. Just as the opening, we see a camera that flies over the city and then moves in closer. I was talking earlier about the need in the police procedural to map the whole city, and one of the obvious ways you map a city is to stand above it, look down on it. So on the one hand, there's a kind of bird's eye looking down on the city. On the other hand, you go down to street level and you actually go into people's heads. So the narration isn't just godlike, it's also democratic and diffused and spread through the people. So I think that's another function. And then a curious final function, which you don't see in other police procedurals, is because it's not just any authoritative male voice, but the voice of the producer, it's not nameless. Whereas in most police procedurals, we have no idea. You know, if you ask people who narrates the opening of Dragnet, they wouldn't know. And it's no one that we associate directly with the production of the film. It's simply a disembodied voice. But here, very clearly, it's a voice that's embodied. It's Mark Hellinger. One of the ironies is Hellinger died around the time of the production of The Naked City, and this was his last film. So we're very reminded of the frailty of a body also. Among other things, by identifying itself, by situating the voice as being that of the producer, the film is also finally saying, even though this was realism, we're showing you the city, we're not going to be Hollywood, nothing was filmed on the studio set. It's also saying this is just a film. This is just an entertainment. Yeah. It's saying this was just one crime among many, but it's also saying this was just one film among many. You know, the film ends by saying there are 8 million stories in the naked city, this is one of them. It could have also as easily said there are 8 million stories in Hollywood, this is one of them. And I think, I've been talking about tensions in the film, I think one final tension is that it is on the one hand the Hollywood film that's trying to be not completely a Hollywood film. And many post-war films are trying to engage with a new seriousness, not just be entertainment. Yet clearly this film also is still part of the Hollywood machine, still using, even though it only uses some stars, still using stars, even though it only has some glamour, still having glamour. It has showgirls, it has the world of fashion, it has thrills and chills, even as it has the plotting, methodical investigation. So I think it's caught in the tension almost between Italian neorealism, where nothing happens, then trying to create this perfectly controlled imaginary universe. And Naked City, I think, is both. It's in the streets, but it's very clear that despite its saying that it's on location, it's very clear that there's studio sets, especially many of the interior scenes. It's clear that it's using rear projection at certain moments. So it is also the constructed Hollywood object.
She won't be entirely forgotten. Not entirely. Not altogether. There are 8 million stories in the naked city. This has been one of them.